Hey folks, welcome to the 275th episode of Primo Radical. My guest on the show today is Keith McHenry. He is a co-founder of the group Food Not Bombs. On the show today, we're going to talk about his 40 years of activism. We're going to talk about the mission of Food Not Bombs. And we're also going to discuss the strange shift among anarchists in recent years, where many anarchists have supported the COVID vaccine and NATO. Now, as you can imagine, this is a little bit of a controversial conversation, and I did need to edit some of it out for YouTube. If you would like to see the full unedited version of this interview, please head over to Rumble, Rockfin, or Spotify. That said, this is still a great interview, even in its edited form. So please do stay tuned. And while you're watching, please remember to like, comment, and subscribe. Thanks again, folks. Please stay tuned.
Episode 275. Keith McHenry. Food, Not Bombs.
Keith McHenry, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's beautiful.
Yeah, thank you so much for being on today. You are a co-founder of Food Not Bombs, which is a great organization that I've known about for many years. And I want to talk to you today about the mission of Food Not Bombs, but also your own activist career. So just to start off with, for folks who may not be familiar with you and your story, how did you first get involved in activism and founding Food Not Bombs?
Well, I actually got involved when I was in the 5th or 6th grade. And the thing that most inspired me was the essay by Henry David Thoreau called On Civil Disobedience. And the very first kind of thing I did was a class project for elementary school on pollution in my community, which was Luray, Virginia. And there was a member of our church who owned a tanning factory. And so I interviewed him, and I collected water samples from the head of the river, from right before the factory and right afterwards. And then I urged people to decide which of the water would they prefer to drink. And that was my 5th grade environmental project. And so Vietnam War was happening then. And, so I was really influenced by those things. And also when Martin Luther King was assassinated, and I happened to drive from Luray, Virginia to visit a relative and, with my family to see a relative in Philadelphia, and saw the riots in Philadelphia, spent the evening in Philadelphia in a Black neighborhood during the riots. And so I saw, my school was desegregated when I was in the 6th grade, which meant that all the Black people were sent to the special education class so they wouldn't interfere with the good white people. And because I was from out of town, I was in the special education classroom as well, with people with Down syndrome and difficulties, and Black people. So I had that kind of, upbringing, and that really influenced me. But then the start of Food Not Bombs happens, and I'm an art student at Boston University, and I'm taking American history with Howard Zinn, and he's talking about protests in New Hampshire against Seabrook Nuclear Power Station. So I started going up to those protests.
That was the Clamshell Alliance, right?
Yeah, it was Clamshell Alliance and the Coalition for Direct Action at Seabrook, which was sort of a more militant, nonviolent direct action movement, and probably more influenced by anarchists than, there was a lot of us were basically anarchists at that time. So I went up to the October 6th, 79 occupation attempt. Our idea was to break into the construction site and occupy it, and not allow the construction to continue. And then we did the same thing on May 24th, 1980. And that's what basically the date that we found Food Not Bombs, because the 8 of us that became Food Not Bombs united that day to because one of our friends, Brian Feigenbaum, one of the co-founders, was arrested for felony assault of a police officer. And we found fortunately a person with money who could bail him out. And then on our way home to Boston from New Hampshire, we discussed what we'd do to raise money. And one of our ideas was to do bake sales. Well, they were fabulously unsuccessful. And also at that time, we had like a shared van in our van. We did a moving company called Smooth Move. So we're moving this family that had a poster that said, wouldn't it be a beautiful day if the schools had all the money they needed and the Air Force had to hold a bake sale to buy a bomber. And so we started to do these political bake sales dressed in, used military uniforms and so on. And we found that the dialogue with the people walking by was really positive. And while we didn't really make more money, we found it did attract attention, and it did have people talk to us about nuclear disarmament and nuclear power. And then the other thing that happened, I was a produce worker before going to classes. I would set up the produce at Bread and Circus, which is now a Whole Foods in Central Square. And I felt horrible about throwing away all this food every afternoon or every morning. So I started taking it on my way to school to the housing projects about maybe 3 or 4 blocks away on Portland Avenue. And there was these vacant lots behind MIT, which are now no longer vacant. But one of the new buildings, the first building in this area that's now called Tech Square, was Draper Laboratory, and it was directly across the street from the housing projects. And the people at the projects, the mothers, were telling me about how they were designing nuclear weapons in this building. And so that's where I come up with the name Food Not Bombs, because I couldn't believe. And Food Not Bombs really was a slogan on a flyer. And for that, during that little period of time, we were called the Food for Free Committee. But we decided, no, the name Food Not Bombs made a lot more sense. So all those things came together. And finally, the thing that really is like what we know of as Food Not Bombs today was we were going to dress up as hobos and get our friends to look like hobos and set up a soup line outside the stockholders meeting of the Bank of Boston and on Atlantic Avenue at the Federal Reserve Bank near South Station. And the night before, we realized we had done such poor outreach to the activist community that it didn't seem like there would be a line of people actually there. And then that kind of emotional impact of a line of people lining up to get food, which in those days would be very, have a huge impact since there weren't soup lines at that time. And so I decided I'd go to the Pine Street Inn shelter, which was a holdover from the Great Depression. And there's about like 30, 40 guys there, maybe sitting around. They didn't even have beds in those days. You just sat in a room to not freeze to death. This is on March 25th of turning into March 26th of 1980, about 30 days after Reagan was inaugurated president for the first time. And so we gave a speech there, and they were like, oh, this is cool, protests like the 60s. And they'd tell me about some protest they were at in DC or something. And then the next day they showed up, and it was shocking to pedestrians walking by. And some of the stockholders flipped us off. Others, said, yeah, this was bank as criminal, and I'm in there to vote against something on a proxy vote or whatever. And it was so successful from the people eating with us. They were like, wow, you should just do this every day. There's no food for homeless people in Boston. And so we just thought, wow, this is so beautiful that that night when cleaning up, we decided we'd quit our jobs and do nothing but collect food from grocery stores, bakeries, and farmers markets and so on, and then take that food to the housing projects. And we set up a whole system of delivery of housing projects in the Boston area. And then also every afternoon we would do street theater with food at Harvard Square or the Boston Commons. And so that's how I ended up spending the rest of my life doing Food Not Bombs. That was the start of it.
And could you speak to how Food Not Bombs grew from there and how many cities it's in currently?
Yeah, so we did it for 8 years in Boston, and eventually in a conflict over the civil rights of homeless people in Kenmore Square, which is where Fenway Park is and all that. And I had a business there doing graphic design for the Red Sox and things. My association that I was a member of freaked out and that I would not support, and that there became a movement to support the homeless people that lived in Kenmore Square because they were our dear friends, like Mr. Butch and so on. And that became very volatile, and then I ended up having to leave town. So I moved to San Francisco, and an acquaintance of mine that I knew from Veterans for Peace, Brian Wilson, had been hit by a train at Nuremberg Actions in Concord Naval Weapons Station in Concord, California. And I went to the huge protest that Saturday, and I realized I had been hiding out, being underground because there was a certain mafia connection to my fleeing Boston. And I ended up deciding, well, I'm not underground anymore. So my wife at that time, Andrea, and myself decided we'd just restart a second Food Not Bombs. And so I took notes on how I was starting this group. And then on August 15th of 88, we got arrested for serving food without a permit which we had applied for in July at the encouragement of a person who turned out to be the director of a local soup kitchen, who was kind of forced into it by the police. He had a choice of either his soup kitchen shutting down or him helping the police shut us down. And so there was 9 arrests on August 15th of 88. And then there were another, I believe, 24 arrests a week later. And that is when, turns out in the last year or so, we've just, in FOIA documents, found out that the FBI Joint Terrorism Task Force had declared us a credible national security threat in a memo they sent to the San Francisco field office. The weird thing about that, there was 30 Food Not Bombs people in the world, probably. There was about 10 in Boston now at that time. There was 10 in San Francisco and another 10 friends or so, maybe even less than that, in Long Beach, California. So to be a national security threat for refusing to stop serving food just because the riot police came out and arrested people, apparently triggered this kind of interest. And I have to say, probably the FBI was interested in what we were doing all along, but had not really been. I mean, for instance, we were with Pledge of Resistance in Boston, and it became a famous case of the FBI breaking into Old Cambridge Baptist Church to steal the computer files and everything. So we were in that mix, and so that probably wasn't the first time the FBI paid attention to us, but it is the first memo declaring us a national security threat. So anyway, those arrests continued till there was and because of those arrests, that month, which ended on Labor Day with about 2,000 people showing up to risk arrest. I think about 54 people were arrested on that day for serving food without a permit. And it made world news. And so people would write me, back in those days, they would have to just write my name or the words Food Not Bombs, San Francisco, California. And then I would get it, the letters, including letters from Europe. Just from that, because we were on CNN, we were in the London Times, the Times of India, and so on for these arrests, because that was very unusual to be arrested for feeding people. And so I took my notes and made a flyer called 7 Steps to Starting a Food Not Bombs, and then I would mail that to you. And that first groups that started were really in Portland, Oregon, and I think there was one briefly started in Washington, D.C., but fell apart and then restarted later. There was groups in Seattle, and so on. And then there became a more arrests a year later, and then more groups would respond. And eventually we had our first world gathering, which was in October of 1992, which coincided with the publishing of a book that I co-wrote with one of the other co-founders, C.T. Butler. And we held it in San Francisco in the days before the 500th anniversary of Columbus invading the New World. And we then participated with the indigenous people's huge protests and provided food for them at both when they pushed Columbus back out into the San Francisco Bay at Aquatic Park and at the giant demonstration at Civic Center Plaza. And so in that, the only internationalness of that was actually like a person or 2 people from British Columbia. But it did inspire the news of it, the literature about it, The fact that we had started a pirate radio network with Free Radio Berkeley, with and San Francisco Liberation Radio was happening. Then we called another global world gathering in '95, and that's where we founded Indie Media, and we started organizing even more. And about 1,000 people went through our convergence center at that, and it just really spread dramatically, because during that time, about 130 of us were arrested for serving food. So we got to have, over a course of 10 days, at a protest that was at United Nations Plaza, because that's where we held the gathering, was basically in warehouses near there. And it's because that was the 50th anniversary of the founding of the United Nations. And the mayor, who was arresting us and arresting homeless people in massive sweeps and so on, was also going to dedicate a monument at UN Plaza to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And so the combination of those things attracted a lot of people to come to San Francisco to participate in this 10-day event. And we took over. We'd also, in '92, started a movement called Homes Not Jails, where, because of the savings and loan crisis, we were taking over abandoned buildings. And according to the book No Trespassing, we had keys to 400 buildings, which seems pretty reasonable when you consider we had a whole wall at the tenants union of nothing but keys and addresses. And we housed people in about 100 of those buildings at any given time. And so during the gathering, we actually organized the takeover of buildings at the Presidio Army base, which had just been decommissioned. And we were trying to force the issue of what was called the Stewart-McKinney Act, which is abandoned military properties were supposed to be turned over to nonprofit groups to house the homeless. And needless to say, the Stewart-McKinney Act never was made real, with very few exceptions. I think there was one housing project in Novato at a military base up there, and there might have been another one in another state. But really, that law never resulted in decommissioned military bases becoming housing for unhoused veterans or for homeless people. So anyway, that event really sparked a huge interest. And then I'd say the other way that we became active in at least 1,000 cities now and 65 countries is we always included information about food, or fortunately, punk bands would often include information on their liner notes about Food Not Bombs. So like Fat Mike did a lot of promotion with all of his different bands about Food Not Bombs, and particularly Good Riddance was basically all the money that was ever any profits from Good Riddance were redirected to Food Not Bombs. And we had a similar thing with Propagandhi, did a lot of work. And then punk bands started touring in other countries as well. So there was a French punk band that toured Philippines, and they started something like about 25 Food Not Bombs chapters during their tour. Another punk band that traveled to Indonesia started groups there. So this became we were always connected to the punk scene right from the beginning in 1980, feeling that we needed to have like kind of our own cultural non-authoritarian anarchist music, that because those of us that founded Food Not Bombs grew up in the 60s when rock music was revolutionary and not corporate owned yet, and or not so corporate owned from our perspective as young people protesting racism in the Vietnam War. And so that melting of culture and music and our street theater and all just helped it grow to be what it is today. And I have no idea really how many groups. It's what last I kind of could get a check on it was roughly 1,000 groups. But I mean, every day little tiny towns and countries that didn't even hardly realize existed, report that they have a Food Not Bombs chapter. But we're decentralized, non-hierarchical, with basically united around three principles. And those three principles are the food is always free to anyone, rich or poor, drunk or sober, and that's vegan or vegetarian. And the second is that we have no presidents or capitals or directors or headquarters or anything like that. That each group's autonomous and makes decisions as a collective, often using the consensus process. But a main focus of that is including the people that depend on our food to be participants in the decision making of local chapters. And then the third is that we're not a charity, but that we're dedicated to taking nonviolent direct action to change society, so no one has to be eating at a soup kitchen or living on the streets. And so those three principles are what held us together, and why we can have groups that are in super active and primarily Muslim countries, primarily Christian countries, primarily secular countries. Like it just has a universality to it, and that I think it is really amazing. It just crosses all kinds of communities. There's rainbow people that do food not bombs, and then there's anarchist punks, and then there's like church groups that do food not bombs. So it's this really interesting amalgamation of possibilities, as long as people generally stick to the three principles. And so I think that right now, though, because of the current threat of nuclear war, that seems to be growing by the moment, considering that, for instance, U.S.-backed military in Ukraine has been bombing major bases internally in the center of in the interior of Russia, that we are on really this edge. And then we're sending billions of dollars in weapons to the Ukrainian military, while our people are going without. So the first shipment of money and weapons to Ukraine would have been, according to the Housing and Urban Development, exactly the amount of money needed to end homelessness in the United States. But we made that choice without a vote, and just off to neo-Nazis to wage a proxy war against Russia.
Well, I do want to get into that in a minute, but I did just want to ask first, how would you describe the need for food and shelter currently in the U.S.? Is it worse than it was in previous years? Does it depend on the area of the country? Like, how would you describe the need that's out there currently?
I think it's increasing every single area of the country. So I answer the hunger hotline, 1-800-884-1136. And I get calls, desperate calls, particularly right now. There's a huge crisis in SNAP, EBT, food stamps, where people, like, just randomly their food stamps get cut and then they have to reapply. And I don't know if you spend time with this happening everywhere. So I'm getting calls across the country and from people desperate for food. So I think that's the case. Well, I know that most of our groups, like in Santa Cruz, we can tell by the amount of paper products, paper plates we go through, which we have these compostable paper plates that are donated by World Centric, and they're just like, we're having to restock all the time. The amount of water we have to get, we get filtered water because our water is really toxic here in Santa Cruz. So we're just filling 6, 8 5-gallon jugs every day or two now because the numbers are growing, and it's definitely, I would say the poverty is extreme right now, and it's going to get a lot worse. And I know we're preparing generally as food not bombs all over the world for a global economic collapse and a dramatic increase in hunger and homelessness that's even greater than the current need. The Bureau of the Census Bureau said that 3.8 million American families were expected to be evicted in October of 2022. I think we can we're already seeing the impact of that with new faces showing up to eat at our local Food Not Bombs chapter.
Yeah, and again, I think it is great what you're doing, what you have been doing for decades, because you're building something outside of the system that isn't seemingly dependent on other infrastructure, and bringing people together, like you said, with from different backgrounds or with different beliefs. And that seems like it'd be great in a situation like a crisis, like a global food shortage. So I'm curious if you can speak to how that kind of ties back to anarchist philosophy, and if you still consider yourself an anarchist, correct?
Oh yeah, I am the author of the what I call the Real Anarchist Cookbook, which um, I corresponded with William Powell, the author of the original one, and got not that I needed his permission, but I got his permission to reprint his denunciation of that book, and get sort of his blessing of rewriting the entire book to the about anarchism, as opposed to just trying to get out of going to the Vietnam War, which is what the original text was about. It had nothing to do with anarchism. But yeah, I think right now we're at this amazing point in history where the philosophy of anarchism is probably be more important, because the institutions are completely corrupt in as far as like governments and the corporations and so on, and having a decentralized, non-hierarchical, and disrespect for the institutions and authority could not be a more valuable attitude to have right now. And the other thing about Food Not Bombs being based on anarchist philosophy, there's literally tens of thousands of people around the world who have done Food Not Bombs. And they have experienced directly themselves organizing logistics to handle survival issues without having the authority to tell you what to do or to control you. So, for instance, in California, they made a law that would have basically killed Food Not Bombs. Under the Environmental Health Department claimed that they were going to make it easier to get an environmental health permit. And we had a gathering in Oakland, and we came to an agreement, as all Food Not Bombs groups in California, that we would never comply with this law. And that they tried to force the Santa Cruz chapter into complying with this law, and we just said we actually will not do that. At the same time that they were trying to get us to comply with that law, which they could not enforce because of our popular support amongst regular people. Really is where it came down to. They also they had a cease and desist order restraining us from serving free food to the homeless, and we ignored that. And then it was interesting what had happened with that. 3 or 4 weeks later, people would come to us and say, "Well, we thought you were shut down because the media had all this thing about how you had been given a cease and desist order, but here you are, you're still doing it, nothing changed." Then they made another law against us serving food, and then we ignored that one. And then the chief of police came out and tried to convince us to stop feeding the hungry, and we said, well, we will not be doing that, and I don't think it's probably in your best interest to do it, because then you'll have hundreds and hundreds of hungry people with no access to food, and where they're going to get it, they're eventually going to just start rampaging Trader Joe's and the other groceries in downtown. And is that really a good use of law enforcement time, or so on? So by maintaining our independence, it's actually been very, very empowering, beyond just Food Not Bombs, but the community itself can see that the city did not feed the hungry, they did not house the hungry, they did not. In fact, their solution in the early part of the pandemic was to build triage cages in parking lots, where they would drive all the homeless into these cages, and then they would have like a portable toilet in there, and then they would supposedly be stuck in there for at least 72 hours, unable to leave. We defied that, and their plan because they tried to get us to lure people into their triage cages, and we refused to cooperate. We said, look, just put people in all the abandoned hotel rooms in the city, and then the buildings that are empty, and house everybody. You don't do that. We just refuse to cooperate with you. And their plan fell apart within less than 24 hours. Because in the end, we had to feed the one group that got put in a triage cage, and we were the people providing them with all their support and everything. And that was it. They put those 15, 20 people in a hotel for 2 weeks and shut their whole program down. So no, I think the thing is that we're fluid with being anarchists. We're fluid with the reality of what's happening on the street, as long as we keep our principles that were, that there's non-hierarchical, that were, in our case, dedicated to nonviolence, and that we're going to meet the actual real needs of people as they exist on the street. While it's clear governments of all the way from the federal government down to the city government, they knew that there'd be millions and millions of people becoming homeless because of the lockdowns and the shutting of businesses and so on, and they did nothing really for that.
So yeah, I've first got attracted to anarchism or learned about anarchism during the Bush years, and this was, when there was the Black Bloc protesting the Iraq War, and that's when I first found out about indie media and about Food Not Bombs. And it's funny for me, kind of like looking at how the anarchists who are sort of involved politically, or at least most vocally, their politics has seemed, from my opinion, to change a bit from that time period, where a lot of anarchists who you'd see out there were anti-war, anti-imperialist. And I've been noticing more and more over recent years, there seems to be more pro-imperialist sentiments within anarchism. I noticed this in some interviews I did with Noam Chomsky, who I don't think he calls himself an anarchist completely, but he says he's like in the same vein as libertarian socialism. But in one interview I had with him, he said he supported the U.S. military, protecting the Kurds, so having an active role in the Middle East. It just seems, I guess, a little counterintuitive, because you've been so outspoken against the U.S. acting as a global police force, especially in concert with NATO.
I'm not opposed to the police either. If my house gets robbed, I call the police. Okay? I'm against the police when they shoot people. But these social and political world is not an axiom system where there are simple rules that you just follow rigorously. It doesn't make any sense. Life's much too complicated for that. You have to ask about the consequences of the policies you're talking about. So it takes a contingent of U.S. troops in Rojava, the Kurdish areas. I don't want to see U.S. forces abroad. I also don't want to see Kurds massacred. Okay? You have to make a choice sometimes.
In a more recent interview, he was very supportive of the COVID vaccine, requirements and everything that went along with that. I interviewed Howie Hawkins back in 2020. By the way, did you know Howie Hawkins from the Clamshell Alliance?
I didn't really know him, no.
Okay.
No, he was, yeah.
And he also has described himself as being influenced by anarchism, and he's in the interview I did with him, he was very boisterous against Russia, and kind of said some things about Chelsea Manning and Julian Assange that was critical of them. And I don't know if you're familiar with Vosh, but he's this streamer. He's this rich Beverly Hills kid who purports to be an anarchist, but he's very in favor of NATO. But in any case, I've noticed this a lot over the years, where recent years, where there seems to be more apologies for Washington, and more kind of siding with Washington against the authoritarian tanky regimes overseas. And effectively, like, it seems as though a weaponization of anarchism in favor of U.S. foreign policy. I'm just curious if you've noticed that too, and if you have any sort of thoughts on my observations there.
Yeah, I would say with the March 2020, everything seemed to flip, and I was shocked that anarchist friends of mine would actually be posting initially, before there was like the drumbeat of war with Russia was happening, the whole COVID, like, people I organized against Big Pharma with then were demanding people get the injections from the same Big Pharma they were protesting only months before. And I found that shocking. And then there was a Facebook profile, I don't know what they call them, what goes around your face, where it was like, fuck authority, I'm vaccinated, in red and black. And I had a bunch of friends that I organized with that were anarchists that put that on their faces. And then I had, then there was a number of like really other prominent anarchists and who would then post that they were wanting people to get the vaccine. There was even punks for vaccine that were led by anti-fascist punk groups, who would then also So it's, and there's even there were anarchist organizations that organized pro-mandate, pro-lockdown marches in Melbourne, Australia, and things. So then it flipped to Russia bad, and so we had like a global Food Not Bombs Zoom meeting, and there a lot of the people that lived in the former, I mean, they weren't alive when the former Soviet Union was controlling events in Eastern Europe, but they were like, so like, we brought up the idea that we wanted to have like a unified no invasion of by Russia of Ukraine and NATO, and abolish NATO, and there was huge pushback. No, Putin is Hitler. Putin is Hitler. We need to arm Ukrainians. We need to arm Ukrainians. And there was huge denial of Azov or Right Sector or any of the other groups that Food Not Bombs kids were writing me about in the 8 years since the U.S. coup of Ukraine. And a lot of my information about what was going on in Ukraine was happening directly between me and correspondence between me and Ukrainian anarchists about Azov and Bandera movements and so on. And then all that, once February 24th of 2022 happened, we lost all contact with anarchists in Ukraine, and there became kind of this tension where it was like we stopped having these global Zoom meetings because it was like, we're so divided between whether NATO should be shut down and whether there was a belief that the U.S. was fighting NATO, Putin, and that was super important, and that who cares if Biden administration and Obama administration had overthrown the government and put in their own people. Like somehow that, and it was shocking because I've been in anti-NATO protests from as early as '92 in Europe, and participated in the anti-NATO protests in Istanbul back when Bush was speaking in support of NATO there. And the left used to be against war. We used to be against, anarchists used to be against censorship. That was like a hallmark of one of our ideas. But now many of my anarchist friends are completely in support of censorship, although they will call it misinformation. They bought into that whole thing, and the militarism. It is really quite shocking. So I interviewed with Paul on Winter Oak, who's an anarchist in France, and he and I were in dismay early on in this crisis about how we lost our anarchist friends. And then it was fortunate that podcasts, like Convo Couch and eventually Jimmy Dore and others were like coming from a left perspective about like we had these these visions, this we were against corporate power, a corporate dystopia, and so on, and what happened. So I can totally, it's astounding. But when when Paul published my interview on Winter Oak, I received emails and phone calls from anarchists all over the country, like some in tears, because they felt so alone by their anarchist friends bullying them into trying to get the jab, trying to comply with supporting internment of unvaccinated people and all the cruel things that happened early on in the COVID lockdown part of the country. And then during that, so for me, I've been outside for, it'll be like 1,000 days on the 10th of December that we've shared every single day outside, because the other soup kitchens in Santa Cruz were closed due to the lockdown. And what we witnessed on the streets is completely different than what one would ever imagine if you sat at home and watched the news and listened to NPR and stuff. So it became, there's a definite it is. It's just really crazy that you, with your own eyes, you can see what is happening. You can experience what is happening. You can base your information on actual scientific information. So I have an anarchist friend who was a leading virologist who came to me and my girlfriend early on before the jabs came out, saying, whatever you do, don't. Data and stuff because during the clampdown, and that freaked her out. Even predating March 2020, she was seeing that something fishy was up, and she was she of course is ignored and silenced and so on by other anarchists, even though she is probably the most knowledgeable in that particular area of any of the other people in the anarchist community that are pushing quarantine and mandates and masking and jabs and all that. And then when the Ukrainian war, it's the same series of lies. So we were out protesting weapons of mass destruction. Victoria Nuland was in Cheney's, an aide to Cheney at the time, pushing this narrative that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq and that we should go to war there. And we could see now that Iraq is in total chaos, and from the devastation of the U.S. war against them. Libya, same thing. Syria, same.
Yeah, and you can really tie the U.S. foreign policy here directly back to the Bush administration. They're the ones who announced initially that Ukraine should be joining NATO, and their involvement in the Orange Revolution there. And even going back to Bush ripping up the ABM treaty at the end of 2001, and how that kind of was getting the ball rolling here. So yeah, I mean, from my perspective, it just seems as though there was a very successful psyop to market neoconservatism to the left. Everywhere from centrist liberals to anarchists. And I personally think it goes back a little bit further in 2020, because I was at the Trump inauguration protests in 2017. And the Antifa folks there were all kind of signs that were, like they'd have a flag, the U.S. flag, but they'd have the stars cut out and have the Russian flag. And there were signs about, Putin and Trump. So, I think that was a major part of it too. And it's just, it's such an odd thing where, again, just watching the transformation of these folks who were protesting U.S. imperialism to now protesting Russian imperialism and protesting Chinese imperialism, and thinking that somehow China is more of a right-wing authoritarian state than the United States is. It's just it's seemingly so odd. And if you say anything in line with how the left used to think, if you say that you are still anti-imperialist, that you're against NATO, that you're against censorship, that you're against big pharma or big agriculture, then you're a Nazbol, you're part of this red-brown alliance. And it's so odd to me. And again, it seems to me as though it was really an effective psyop that was done on the left in the United States. Is this the case in Europe as well? Like the leftists and anarchists you talk to in Europe, has there been a similar transformation there, or is this really unique to the United States?
Oh no, there's definitely. I think it's less their psyops against anarchists in Europe is less effective. But from what Paul, expressed to me in my conversations with him, he was really shocked that a ton of anarchists, and particularly in England, which is where he was publishing out of, even though he lives in France. So he did lose a lot of friends, I think, because they denounced him for being skeptical about the entire program that's happening with both the war in the Ukraine and with and with the COVID lockdown regulations and so on. So I think it is global. Now, I remember at the very beginning, part of the psyops on the COVID area that was super effective, and I would hear this from people in the early days of COVID, was having people wave Trump flags at, like, say, in Lansing, Michigan, with AR-15s and no anti-lockdown, and people, Proud Boys people with swastikas on tattooed and so on, and made that the lockdown movement. And they did a similar thing where there was a anti-lockdown protesters in LA, which may not have even been anti-lockdown protesters, but this is how it was reported in the Los Angeles media, that were stabbing pedestrians, and they had like tattoos all over themselves, and they had Trump flags and all this. And I think that essentially they were probably FBI, and they were trying to give the impression that, and I think this is all well planned out, that they try to make it into like you're a neo-Nazi if you oppose the lockdowns. You're somehow, I'm accused of being a Trumper. I never would vote for Trump. That's not. I would, if I ever did vote for Trump, it's just to piss off Democrats. It wouldn't be because I thought he had any good policies at all. And then I think also they're really clever at like making the Nazi thing in the U.S., white supremacist, Ku Klux Klan, and all that, which I have been immersed in since. In that world, I have had to survive that since the 60s. So I'm not unaware of the violence and the power of neo-Nazi organizations, Ku Klux Klan, and so on. I mean, we had like a PTA group that was essentially Klan that came to my parents' house and threw rocks through the windows and marched around our house with torches because we defended the only Jewish family in our town from having to be forced to take Christian education against his will and not to be tormented by the other students. So but I think that the anarchists and the left and Democratic Party, they're like trying, even though, as we're finding out, that just like the anarchist community, it's heavily infiltrated by FBI and other surveillance organizations. Manipulating events. And I think the classic, I was with Michio Kaku the day that in Washington, D.C. in the 70s when the Greensboro massacre happened. And that's like classic, where you have an FTA agent get a bunch of Klans members to go to an anti-racist protest. The FTA agent pulled his gun out and has been talking real badass. Points his gun at the protest, and his Klan buddies that he convinced to go there, they pull the trigger with real live ammo, killing a number of protesters. Yeah, I think that the psyops and the infiltration of and basically co-opting the controlled opposition became major in the lead up to the Biden election. And you could see, like, for example, early on, Democracy Now! Interviewed Peter Daszak of EcoHealth Alliance, and ran this huge interview about how definitely no possible way it could be a lab leak. And but she knows Sam Husseini, who's a journalist who's done a lot of research on the history of lab leaks, and had published 2 articles early on about it, one in Salon and I forget the other one. On the potential in the history of lab leaks of U.S. biodefense industry. That's in fact how my friend Shannon, who's a virologist, got involved in this, because she was living in Maryland, and and her partner Carl Tasky was he actually went to Johns Hopkins, and they knew that there was really dangerous gain of function work happening, even in the 90s, and were concerned about that. And yet they didn't invite Sam on to counter Daszak. And then you would see, like with Black Lives Matter, it was, instead of being a grassroots movement fighting for emancipation of Black people and ending police violence, you get like defund the police becomes, let's set up entire new police state apparatus, like the Capitol Police, and then having offices all around the country and more surveillance and so on. So, and then the leader, Cori Bush, becoming a congressperson who then does nothing to help the homeless, even though she got elected because she had been a homeless mother, and she voted for like funding Nazis in Ukraine, and she did like a theater on the steps of the Capitol building, supposedly to stop evictions because of COVID, to extend the eviction moratorium, which completely fell apart instantly. And basically got bought out. So controlled opposition, I would not be, it's really crazy. We went to the anarchist book fair in Oakland, and there was actually a mask block. There's an anarchist group that were very proud that they gave out like so many N95 masks at the outdoor event. And then I have friends that are associates of worked at South End Press and so on, that are just rabidly, which should be like one of the more open-minded, cutting edge presses, of which Michael Albert and Chomsky and them were associated with just totally rabid lockdown proponent and vaccines and so on. So and they received, I have to say, they received funding for they bought the crisis of the narrative, and therefore applied for money, which they got to continue their COVID misinformation that they felt was so important. So you can see this throughout all levels of the community, going through buying into this narrative and accepting money from the same corporations that were also funding.
Well, I mean, I think that's two different things, right? Like, because I think that's happened in progressive media, where TYT got investments from Jeffrey Katzenberg. And by the way, I don't know if you saw, but while Jeffrey Katzenberg was lobbying the LA City Council to criminalize homelessness, right when he was doing that same month, Anna Kasparian was ranting about the homeless on TYT.
I do think that there are progressives, I don't know if it's progressive policy, but progressives in places like California who have made terrible decisions. And so one of those terrible decisions is essentially doing away with anti-camping laws, right? Allowing people to camp out wherever they want, whenever they want. And if, like, we have a homeless problem in California, we have it all throughout the country, but it's particularly bad in California. And so the argument is, well, if there isn't public housing available for people, they should be allowed to camp out. Okay, but there's also a problem right now where there is public housing available, and individuals will say, no, I don't want to take it. I don't want to follow the rules in the public housing. And so as a result, I would rather camp out. Progressive lawmakers are like, we should allow them to camp out. And you know what happens? Crime happens. Open air drug markets happen, and it's the truth. These are the facts of the matter. In fact, it was addressed in this Daily Beast article, and honestly, it was cathartic to read it because everyone denies that this is happening.
But not just TYT, we see investments in from the Ford Foundation and Democracy Now, and Pierre Omidyar owns The Intercept. So obviously, I think there's an influence of money. But I just think about like the regular sort of rank and file people, right? Like the hundreds of thousands of people who attended the anti-war protests during the Bush years. What happened to those people? Again, just because I think that like there's such a disconnect from history. Like I think there's just such amnesia, and it seems as though, especially in terms of anarchists, that like the principles have really gone out the window, and memory has gone out the window. And it's not about the fact that the U.S. is the most powerful right-wing police state in history, and that NATO is a neo-colonial alliance of these powers that have colonized the entire world. That just goes out the window. The fact that we're sending weapons to literal Nazis and backing literal Nazis in Ukraine, like that's just all ignored, and it becomes very emotional. And I just wish these people would go back and read George Orwell and read 1984, probably the most famous anarchist book ever published. I think that would enlighten them on the psyop that has been conducted on them.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's hard to. I think as society collapses, and more and more, sadly, more and more of our associates, end up dying from the jabs. That's already a problem that's happening. Maybe they'll wake up. Maybe it'll traumatize enough people to see that they got duped. If this goes to a global world war, will this anarchist community unite and fight back? There are like slight indications of that, but it is amazing that we are basically drumbeats towards nuclear war is daily, and there's like not hardly any response.
I mean, Ukraine just bombed bases where Russia has nuclear capabilities, and you have to wonder how much of that, will Russia tolerate before it starts seeing this as an attack by NATO on their nuclear capabilities. And meanwhile, you have these people who are just cheering it on and thinking it's a great thing Ukraine is taking the fight to the Ruskies.
Yeah, it's frightening. And totally ignoring all the different obvious NATO sabotage of the pipelines. And then also, what's really horrible, what really disturbed me is, so I've been an anarchist since 1965, and then to see, so I've been a vegan since the 70s, and now the vegan thing has turned into like I've been an environmentalist forever. I've been anti-racist forever. I've been opposed to homophobia, and now all that's been twisted by the system to, it's like almost repulsive. So it's not about really dealing with the like, if you want to stop climate change and you are an anarchist, one of the things you would be calling for is an end to militarization. Half of all fossil fuels burned in the United States are burned by the U.S. military. You would have a huge impact from that. But instead, there's like, let's fund that war, but at the same time, I don't go buy electric cars or something. I don't know. It's really, the rank and file definitely has lost its way, and I think maybe older anarchists like myself, we did not build a formidable. I guess we had the illusion that our friends would always remain kind of on this path of non-hierarchical, decentralized organizing and be opposed to militarism, and to always that. I recall like going to another protest in Bonn in '92, and it was labor, environmentalists, human rights activists, all protesting against the single currency of the euro and the European Union, saying that it would end up being this horrible globalization that would go forward. Then I was like, where I first started talking and spending time with Vandana Shiva was in organized against the People's Global Agenda, which was all, we were divided pretty much half anarchists, half communists and socialists. Thousands of people came to the founding convention, and we were in the streets protesting the World Trade the possibility of the World Trade Organization. I did in 1997. I did the Unfree Trade Tour with anarchists from Spain, because advocating that the IMF, World Bank, that basically from the Bretton Woods Convention after World War II on, there was like this stepping up of a globalized economy, and then the Fourth Industrial Revolution of the World Economic Forum. We used to go protest that all the time. Anarchists were in the streets. You can go and look in old media reports how. It was not the right wing that was at Davos protesting, it was the left. And then suddenly those same people now support that same program. So, there is, like I've found recently, focusing more on central bank digital currency and using the FTX scam, which seemed to me to be completely a CIA organized psyops. And not like the random Democratic Party fundraiser's kid getting billions of dollars magically and then having some other girlfriend run like another cryptocurrency, project, and then losing billions of dollars of depositors' money and giving it through, donating to Zelensky, and then having Ukraine somehow, and that's the timing of the collapse. And then the other guy who's writing, whose name I forget, who was the competitor, outing the fact that FTX had no actual assets. Turns out he didn't have assets either. I get the impression that he's part of the same, psyops and connected to like some intelligence operation himself. And maybe they were all working together. You just don't know. And then I get this from being the subject of, my skepticism of the police state comes from 500 days in jail for feeding the homeless in San Francisco, from being tortured 3 times in San Francisco, living through many different infiltrations of food not bombs and honey traps and all these things, right? So this is all continuing, and but maybe the thing is, when you realize, and Foucault, a lot, that was also astounding. My friends like calling the truckers in Canada right-wing Nazis and blah, 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 and not even investigating any of that. Like the poor guy that was from Eastern Europe that had the Nazi flag was like saying, we're going to, Trudeau's a Nazi. And then they turn it around to, this poor freedom fighter was a Nazi, so I think that it's really, really outrageous. But when you cut off the money, which happened to the truckers, and then it looks like we're rushing towards central bank digital currency really rapidly. And part of it is to do away with cryptocurrency, and there probably will be cryptocurrency, but it'll be controlled by the government. And my first tip to the fact they're going to ban cryptocurrency was when Colonial Pipeline had that ransomware attack, right? While it's spilling oil into a river, destroying it, but the news is the ransomware attack. And then suddenly the FBI is able to recover the ransomware, which is a highly suspicious, which it sounds like they were ones that were doing the entire thing to begin with.
Right.
And then they had to have all these public hearings. Well, criminals use cryptocurrency, so we have to ban it. And then you have this whole thing with FTX. So it looks like this digital control system and this is where I was talking to people who are really into being vaccinated, really into mandates, really into masks. And then I would go like, then I would never talk to them about that. I'd go, well, you're on strike for wages. Imagine if the central bank digital currency comes about and they decide that you shouldn't strike for better wages. They will just delete all your income and you won't be able to do anything. Or maybe you want to go print up a bunch of strike signs and your digital currency is not available to buy the signs, or many things. And it did kind of wake these people up, and that might be the direction to focus on, is the social control of central bank digital currency, which, if you've been paying attention, is, now we're going to do the climate carbon credits, and that will be a good reason why you can't access your money, because I've heard this week, a number of people have reported that your airline ticket tells you how many carbon credits your flight took. And so all the airlines are all in coordination with that. And, it just seems so clear that the NAFTA and the European Union and the World Trade Organization and the collapsing countries that collapsed because of IMF, World Bank investment policies and austerity programs is all the same thing. There's nothing, it's just a stepping up and a becoming more closely a corporate dystopian future that we've been protesting all along. And it is amazing that it just suddenly, our community just started promoting the thing that we've been fighting against for decades.
Well, I hope that you are right. I hope that the central bank digital currencies do wake people up. Hopefully what's not going to happen is that they're just going to associate protesting that to the right wing, and that if you're against these currencies, then you must be a right winger, because we've just seen that play out over and over again.
Correct.
But Keith, I really appreciate you being on the show today. I know we went a little long, but I'd love to have you back in the future to talk about this and related issues. For folks out there who would like to follow you and support you and maybe get involved with efforts like Food Not Bombs, how can they do that?
Yeah, so our website is foodnotbombs.net, and we are definitely open to people who believe that they need to wear masks and get jabbed. If you want to join Food Not Bombs, we don't want to counsel you because you have a different opinion than I do, and my opinion is definitely not the primary opinion of Food Not Bombs. I would tell you that for sure. yeah, you can find us at foodnotbombs.net. And then we have the toll-free number for if you're looking for food or you have food you can donate. You can call 1-800-884-1136. And I really, the main thing is we're an all-volunteer movement, and I hope that you start your own local chapter if one is not in your town, or organize with the local chapter in your town that pre-exists, and I think the biggest thing right now is we need to be not bombs. We are just not bombs enough, and I think that this is I just wish I could encourage Food Not Bombs to really start getting out on the street all the time and organizing against this war. And I hope by the time you post this that we aren't in a global nuclear war and that people will be able to see it. But I don't think people are getting how dangerous this is. So just to finish up, my grandfather was OSS in Burma, and he was involved in helping organize the distribution of heroin to Black community in the United States to put down any possible Black rebellion after World War II. He also firebombed Tokyo and did Operation Meeting House. And I witnessed, he went to the same schools as Victoria Nuland and all these people that are running the current war. He went to Phillips, Exeter, Dartmouth, and Harvard Law. He was in a secret society, and he like a satanic society, and he was grooming me to participate in this and to grow up doing this. And I watched him argue for the atomic bombing of Hanoi through much of the Vietnam War, with McNamara, arguing with his friends Robert McNamara and Curtis LeMay, saying that we had to send a message to the communists because the ultimate thing from his perspective was to defend capitalism, and that there should be no amount he called it, when I grew up, I would have to determine who lived and who died. And he called it white man's burden. I write about that in my memoir, which I hope is coming out soon, called Soup Street. And so I know how these people think. They actually think they can launch a nuclear war and survive it, and it'll be good for business. And that there's, no matter how many people die, there's it's just the tough luck. That's business, and that's the way the people behind this war think. Probably on both sides, but definitely on the Western side of this conflict. But
well, like you said, I hope the ICBMs aren't going to rain down anytime in the near future. But thank you again, Keith. I really appreciate everything that you do and that you've done over the last 40 years. And I appreciate being on the show today. And I really do hope that I can have you back on at some point in the near future.
Oh, I certainly would love to. Thank you so much.